Babylon stood as the jewel of the ancient world, its towering walls and golden palaces stretching beyond the horizon. At its center was King Nebuchadnezzar, the man who had conquered nations, enslaved kings, and erected the mighty Hanging Gardens. One of the wonders of the world. His word was law and his might unquestioned. But power, as history has shown, has a way of intoxicating even the greatest rulers. One night the king awoke with a start. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. He had seen something in his dreams, something so vivid, so disturbing that it refused to fade from his mind. He summoned his wisest men, the sorcerers, the astrologers, and the magicians of Babylon, but none could interpret it. Then a name surfaced among his advisors: Daniel, a Hebrew captive, a servant of the Most High God, the same man who, years before, had deciphered a dream that foretold the rise and fall of kingdoms. With reluctance and intrigue, Nebuchadnezzar commanded his presence. Daniel arrived, his face calm, his stance unwavering. He listened as the king recounted his vision. "I saw a great tree in the middle of the earth. Its height reached to the heavens, its branches spread across the land. The birds nested in its boughs, and all flesh found shade beneath it. But then, a voice from heaven cried out, 'Cut down the tree, strip it of its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beast's heart be given to him, and let 7 times pass over him.' A hush fell upon the chamber. The king's breath was shallow, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne. 'Tell me, Daniel, what does it mean?' Daniel hesitated, his brow furrowing. He knew the answer, and he knew the weight of what he was about to say. 'My king, the tree is you.' Nebuchadnezzar's fingers twitched. 'You have grown great and mighty, and your dominion stretches over the earth. But the Most High has decreed that you will be brought low. You will be driven from your palace, made to live like the beasts of the field. You will eat grass like an ox, and 7 years shall pass until you acknowledge that heaven rules over men.' Silence, then a laugh, low, rumbling, incredulous. Nebuchadnezzar waved a dismissive hand. Madness. He had built Babylon with his own hands. He was no mere tree to be felled at the whim of the gods. Daniel bowed, his voice steady. 'O king, may this not come upon you, but heed my words, turn from pride and do righteousness, lest this fate befall you.' Nebuchadnezzar's expression hardened. His advisors whispered among themselves. The king had heard enough, but the words had been spoken, and the clock had begun to tick. A year had passed since Daniel had spoken his prophecy. A year since the warning had been delivered, wrapped in wisdom and edged with divine inevitability. But time has a way of dulling the sharpest warnings. The months had rolled by without incident, and soon the king's unease faded into the background. Babylon had not fallen. If anything, it had flourished beyond imagination. The city's walls stood higher than ever, its temples and gardens unrivaled across the world. The Hanging Gardens, built by Nebuchadnezzar for his queen, were said to defy nature itself, a testament to his unmatched power. Armies still marched under his command, crushing distant nations, extending his dominion. Wealth, power, and absolute control were his to wield, and so the words of Daniel became nothing more than an unpleasant memory. One evening, as the city basked in the golden hues of sunset, Nebuchadnezzar stood atop his palace, overlooking his empire. The Euphrates shimmered below, winding through Babylon like a living thing, its surface reflecting the glint of towering ziggurats and bustling markets. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with a warm air thick with the scent of incense and spices. He had built this. He had forged this empire from the dust of the earth, shaping it with his will and his might. He spread his arms wide, as if to embrace the city itself. Is this not the great Babylon I have built as my royal residence, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? The words rang out into the open air, bold and unquestioning. Then the sky above him seemed to darken. The very air around him grew heavy, charged with something unseen yet undeniably present. A chill crawled down his spine, and then it came. A voice, not of this world. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you. The words struck him like a physical blow, reverberating through his very bones. He staggered back, gripping the stone railing for balance, his breath sharp and uneven. His mind reeled. Had one of his advisors spoken? One of the temple priests? Number. This was something else. Before he could respond, a force seized him. His vision blurred, the palace walls rippling like water. The voices of his attendants warped, their words twisting into meaningless echoes. He reached out, but his fingers barely seemed to belong to him. His body felt distant, foreign, as if it no longer obeyed his will. Then the pain struck. It tore through him, raw and merciless, as if his very being was unraveling. He clutched his head, gasping, but the world only spun faster, its edges dissolving into chaos. The golden palace, the empire, the power, all of it was slipping away. Then, with a sudden lurch, he fell. The royal attendants rushed forward, their robes swirling as they reached for their king. But the man they had once called ruler was no longer there. His golden crown had tumbled from his head, rolling across the stone floor. His royal garments were in disarray, torn and sullied as he crawled upon the ground, his fingers clawing at the marble like a desperate, wounded animal. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. The palace guards stepped back. The air was thick with something unspoken, something terrifying. One of the attendants whispered, his voice barely audible, What is happening to him?" But no one had an answer. Nebuchadnezzar staggered to his feet, only to fall forward onto all fours. His breathing was ragged, his muscles trembling. His mind, his very sense of self, was slipping away. A low, guttural noise escaped his throat. Not a cry, not a word, but something primal. His eyes, once sharp with command, were now wild, flickering with an unhinged terror. The palace healers were summoned. Incense was burned. Chants were whispered. But there was no curing what had taken hold of Nebuchadnezzar. For the Most High had spoken, and now the greatest king on earth was no longer a man. He was a beast. The great halls of Babylon, once filled with Nebuchadnezzar's commanding voice, now echoed with whispers of terror. Where was the king? The rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed he had been struck by madness, locked away in a hidden chamber of the palace. Others swore he had vanished into the wilderness, abandoned by the gods. But those who had seen the truth with their own eyes knew better. Nebuchadnezzar had not disappeared. He had been cast out. The city gates yawned open, and the mighty king, or what remained of him, staggered into the wilderness. His royal robes had long since been discarded, replaced by rags and filth. His once proud posture was hunched, his fingers twitching, his eyes darting like those of a cornered animal. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the distant sound of rushing water filling his ears. The wilderness had become his kingdom. His mind was fractured, a storm of half-formed thoughts and fleeting memories. He had been a king, had he not? He had ruled, he had commanded, but those things felt like a distant dream, slipping further away with each passing moment. He dropped to his knees. The ground beneath him was damp and cold, but he barely noticed. His senses had changed. His body no longer sought the comforts of civilization, no longer longed for silk sheets or fine banquets. His hunger gnawed at him. But it was not the hunger of a man. It was the hunger of a beast. His hands, no, his claws tore into the grass, yanking it from the soil. He shoved it into his mouth, chewing feverishly, his jaws moving with an animalistic urgency. The taste was bitter, earthy, but it filled the emptiness inside him. The once mighty Nebuchadnezzar was now reduced to feeding like an ox. Above him, the sky stretched vast and indifferent, the heavens watching as the greatest ruler of his time crawled upon all fours, lost to the world of men. The days turned into nights. The moon rose and fell. Time ceased to have meaning. His nails grew long and twisted, curling like the talons of an eagle. His hair thickened, matted and unkempt, draping over his gaunt frame like the fur of a wild animal. The howls of beasts became his lullaby. The rustling of leaves, his only counsel. Babylon had forgotten him, and he had forgotten himself. The prophecy had come to pass. In the city, within the towering walls of Babylon, the royal court sat in quiet disarray. The throne of Nebuchadnezzar remained empty, a silent testament to the power of the Most High. The advisors who had once bowed before him now whispered among themselves, glancing warily at the empty seat. The same man who had stood above them, who had ruled with an iron will, was now reduced to madness among the beasts of the field. Daniel, the prophet, remained silent. He had foretold this, and it had come to pass exactly as God had decreed. Still, a question remained among those who watched from the palace. Would the king ever return, or was he lost forever? Time had become meaningless. The days passed in a blur of hunger, thirst, and the relentless crawl of the sun across the sky. The man who had once ruled Babylon, the man who had called himself its master, had been reduced to something less than human. Nebuchadnezzar no longer remembered the soft touch of silk, the weight of a golden crown upon his brow, the taste of wine upon his lips. Now his body knew only the damp touch of the earth and the bitter taste of grass. At night, he curled beneath the shadow of twisted trees, his breath shallow, his limbs aching. The cold bit into his flesh, but he did not feel it as a man would. His body was no longer accustomed to warmth, to comfort. He had become one with the wilderness. His thoughts no longer carried the weight of reason. His mind, once a steel trap that had strategized wars and conquered nations, had fractured beyond recognition. Words were distant echoes, memories of language slipping through his grasp like water through his fingers. When he looked at his own hands, he no longer saw the hands of a man. Long, yellowed nails curled like talons at the ends of his fingers. His hair had become a tangled, unkempt mass, hanging over his face, his back, his shoulders. His skin, once perfumed and anointed with oils, was caked in dirt. He stank of sweat, of the earth, of the filth of a creature long removed from civilization. The king of Babylon had become an animal. The stars above him remained unmoved, cold and distant. They had seen the rise of men greater than him and the fall of empires mightier than Babylon. They did not weep for kings. Nebuchadnezzar was alone. The people of Babylon had long since ceased to search for him. Rumors had spread, growing wilder with each passing season. Some believed that the gods had struck him down for his arrogance. Others whispered that he had been taken by the spirits of the wilderness, swallowed by the forest, transformed into something inhuman. And yet, there were some who had seen him. Farmers who toiled in the fields, beyond the city walls spoke in hushed tones of a creature, a wild man that walked on all fours, his eyes hollow, his body frail yet feral. He did not speak. He did not acknowledge them. He only ate the grass of the fields as if he were a beast. Some laughed, others shuddered. A few, remembering the prophecy, whispered among themselves, wondering if this was truly Nebuchadnezzar, the once great ruler of Babylon. Could it be? Could this wild creature, this madman crawling through the dirt, truly be the same king who had once ruled over them with an iron will? The thought was terrifying. If the Most High had done this to the greatest king in the world, what hope was there for lesser men? Within the palace, Daniel waited. He had spoken the truth to Nebuchadnezzar. He had warned him. And now the prophecy had unfolded exactly as foretold. Still, Daniel did not celebrate. He had seen too much of the Most High's power to take pleasure in the downfall of a man, even one as arrogant as Nebuchadnezzar. The king had been brought low, cast into the wilderness to crawl on his belly like a beast. But was that the end of his story? Would Nebuchadnezzar remain in darkness forever? Or did the Most High still have plans for the fallen king? Daniel did not know, and so he waited. 7 years had passed, 7 years of crawling upon the earth, of drinking from the rivers like an animal, of feeling the gnawing hunger that never fully left him. 7 years of forgotten speech, of a fractured mind drifting through the abyss of madness. The days and nights had blurred into one endless cycle. His existence reduced to nothing but survival. And yet, something had begun to stir deep within him. A whisper, a presence, a memory. At first it came like a flickering light in the depths of his mind, barely noticeable beneath the haze of his existence. But as the moons passed overhead, it grew stronger. Words, language, meaning. Who was he? The thought struck him one evening as he crouched in a meadow, his hands tangled in the earth, his mouth filled with the bitter taste of grass. The question was so alien, so unfamiliar, that it sent a shudder through his body. Who was he? Something in the sky drew his gaze. The heavens stretched above him, vast and infinite, their stars cold and unchanging. He had seen them countless times before, but tonight they spoke to him. Not in words, not in sound, but in something deeper, something older, something eternal. And in that moment, something broke. The walls of his mind, the heavy fog that had suffocated him for years, began to lift. He could feel it now, a presence greater than himself, a force that had been with him long before he had fallen into madness. It had never left him. The thought was too great to bear. He fell onto his knees, trembling. The Most High, the same God who had warned him, the same God whom Daniel had spoken of. He was real. Nebuchadnezzar had spent his life believing in his own power, worshipping gods made of gold and stone, claiming dominion over the earth. But he had been wrong, so very wrong. His lips trembled, forming words that he had not spoken in years. He lifted his head to the heavens, and for the first time in his life he uttered a prayer, not of pride nor of power, but of surrender. The Most High reigns. And the moment those words left his lips, the chains of madness shattered. His mind, broken for 7 long years, suddenly became whole. Clarity flooded him like a rushing river. He gasped, his chest heaving, his limbs shaking. He was Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and he had been humbled. The news spread across the city like wildfire. The lost king had returned. At first, the people did not believe it. How could he still live? How could the man who had been cast into the wilderness as a beast suddenly walk among men once more. But when they saw him, when they looked into his eyes, they knew it was him, but he was not the same. Gone was the arrogance that had once defined him. The man who returned to the palace was quieter, humbler, his steps measured, his gaze heavy with something new. His throne awaited him, untouched for 7 years. Slowly, he approached it. His fingers ran along the golden edges, his eyes reflecting the weight of all he had lost. He turned to his court, the same men who had once bowed in fear of his wrath. Now they stood in awe of something else, a man who had fallen to nothing and had been restored. Nebuchadnezzar did not sit upon the throne immediately. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward the heavens, and for the first time in his life, he gave thanks. Nebuchadnezzar sat upon his throne once more, but the weight of it felt different now. The golden seat that had once symbolized absolute power was no longer a place of pride. It was a reminder. His advisors, his servants, the nobles of Babylon, they all stood before him, their eyes filled with disbelief. Some expected him to rage, to command the execution of those who had doubted his return. Others simply marveled at the impossible. A man who had vanished into madness, now restored before their very eyes. Nebuchadnezzar did not speak for a long time. He let the silence stretch, let the moment settle. Then, when he finally opened his mouth, his voice was no longer the voice of a king demanding obedience. It was something else, something humbled. The Most High reigns over the kingdoms of men, and he gives them to whom he will. A murmur rippled through the chamber. This was not the Nebuchadnezzar they had known. This was not the man who had once commanded statues of gold to be built in his honor, who had thrown men into fire for refusing to worship him. This was someone changed, someone who had looked into the abyss and found something greater than himself. His eyes swept over the court, his gaze lingering on Daniel. The prophet stood as he always had, composed and unwavering, as though he had known all along that this moment would come. Nebuchadnezzar rose from his throne and turned toward the great balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting Babylon in golden light. He had once believed that this was his doing, that the beauty and power of this place were his creation alone. Now he understood. For 7 years he had been nothing. Stripped of his title, his power, his very humanity, the world had moved on without him. The sun had continued to rise and fall. The rivers had continued to flow. The people had continued to live. He was not the center of the universe. He was not its master. And yet, the Most High had restored him. A different kind of fear settled in his chest. Not the fear of losing his kingdom. Not the fear of rival kings or traitors in his court, but the fear of something far greater. A reverence that gripped him to his very core. He turned back to his people. Let it be known that I, Nebuchadnezzar, once thought myself above all men. I believed my own hands had built this empire. I was blind, and so I was cast down, made to wander the fields like a beast, to forget what it was to be human. A hush fell over the court, even the smallest whisper silenced by the weight of his words. But the Most High is merciful. He did not destroy me. He restored me, that I might know the truth, that all power comes from him, and him alone. Let this kingdom stand as a testimony, not to my greatness, but to his. The murmurs swelled into something greater, not of fear, but of awe. A king who had once demanded worship now stood before them as a man who bowed to a power greater than himself. That night, the city of Babylon did not celebrate. There were no feasts, no parades, no proclamations of conquest. But those who had seen the return of the king would never forget. Nebuchadnezzar had been humbled, and in his humility he had found wisdom. Above him the stars shone as they always had, indifferent to the rise and fall of men. But for the first time, Nebuchadnezzar did not look upon them with pride. He looked upon them with gratitude. Years passed, and Nebuchadnezzar ruled differently than before. His hand was no longer heavy with arrogance, his commands no longer laced with unchecked pride. His kingdom remained strong. Babylon still gleamed under the sun. But those who served him could see that the man upon the throne was not the same king they had once feared. He no longer demanded statues be built in his image, no longer claimed that his power was his alone. The man, who had once declared himself a god among men, now spoke only of the one who had the power to raise and humble kings alike. One evening, as he stood upon the same balcony where he had once proclaimed his own greatness, he looked out at his city and knew that his time was nearing its end. He had been given a second chance. He had been made low, but in that humility, he had found something greater than power. Turning from the view of Babylon, he walked back into his palace, his steps slow, deliberate. There would be no golden statues to preserve his name, no great monuments declaring his victories, but his story, the story of a man who had been made to wander the earth like a beast, only to be restored by the mercy of the Most High. That would live on, and it would serve as a warning to the proud, to the rulers of men, to all who believed themselves beyond the reach of God. No kingdom, no throne, no name was greater than he who ruled the heavens. And Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king of his time, had learned that lesson with his very soul. He left no words of conquest in his final days, no declaration of eternal dominion, only this: "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." And with that, the sun set on his reign. His kingdom passed to others. His name became legend. But the lesson remained. The Most High reigns, and he gives the kingdoms of men to whom he will.